It's great to be with you. I was there yesterday. I attended the sessions, and I was really thrilled by the wealth and the wide range of new research that this group is putting together. And indeed, we don't have at the OECD, we don't have so many opportunities to be exposed to that kind of research. So really, thank you for the opportunity. I also take the opportunity of addressing a science or academic audience to try to take a step back and reflect on my own work. So some of the things I will have to say, especially at the end of my talk, obviously don't reflect the official OECD mantra. It's more my personal rendering. My background is in social and political theory. I'm not an economist myself. Don't say it, otherwise I lose my job. But I'll take that background. I will build on that background to reflect on what we do at the OECD. First thing I would like to highlight is a word of caution. The ambition from knowledge to action is actually quite daunting. So I would like to recast it and talk about the connection between action-oriented knowledge. I fully acknowledge that some research doesn't need to be action-oriented, and I assume that some of the presentations yesterday were not directly meant to inform policymakers or other kind of action. What may be more challenging is to also acknowledge that a lot of action taken, including by governments, may not be knowledge-based. And that's critical to realize because, as Raymond said, the OECD puts a lot of emphasis in data, producing its own data, doing its own quantitative research. We are very often quoted as a source of statistics and new data, and still it's quite unclear what governments do with that kind of data. It's something I would like to reflect upon at the end of the talk. I don't take it for granted that you're familiar with what the OECD is and what we do on water, so just a couple of points. We like to present ourselves as a forum where governments meet to share about what works well, what works less well, and to derive some inspiration on how to improve policies. At the moment, we have 35 members, but we work with more than 80 countries worldwide. A distinctive feature of the OECD, we are an economic organization. So everything we do, we approach it from an economic perspective. The OECD is an unashamed advocate for economic globalization and true believers in economic instruments, market mechanisms to promote growth, including sustainable growth. I'll come back to that. Our mantra is better policies for better lives. So we really want to be policy relevant. We really want to be influential and have an impact on how governments form and reform their policies. On water, we focus on two broad sets of issues, water economics and water governance. I will focus on the first one, although I acknowledge the interconnection between the two. I work in the Environment Directorate, and in my team, what we really emphasize is water as a driver for sustainable growth. So we've put a lot of emphasis trying to show that investment into water can contribute to growth, can be a new engine for growth, and in particular to sustainable growth. There is other work being done in other parts of the house on water and agriculture. Typically, they have a very interesting work at the moment on agriculture hotspots and how water issues in these hotspots can have global consequences. And you may be aware of the OECD Water Governance Initiative, which puts a lot of emphasis on some of the things that have been mentioned this morning about multi-level governance, stakeholder engagement, that kind of institutional framework. Everything we do is public. So if you go on our water webpage, you have access to all the information and analysis developed by the OECD. The structure of the talk, I would like to take two illustrations of policy issues that we have that we are covering at the moment to illustrate what kind of knowledge we have produced and what kind of knowledge we have used to inform our work. Based on these two illustrations, if you like, I would like to derive some messages or lessons that can be useful to for you, make a call for new type of knowledge that can really inform policy or action, if you like, or policy reform. And I will conclude with a plea for actually a theory of change. I think one of the core element that is missing core knowledge element that is missing at the moment is a theory of change, and I'll get back to that in the end. So our work on water allocation started by a report we published 4 or 5 years ago, the OECD Environmental Outlook. There was a water chapter which I coordinated, and one of the main messages that came out of that work is that if you look to 2050, we project that water demand, global water demand, will rise by 55%, which creates obviously potentially tensions on the resource. And one thing that was hotly debated in the context of that report, if I can find the pointer. Well, I can show it here. Contrary to all other projections globally, we anticipate that water available for irrigation may actually decline, meaning that in the longer term perspective, there may be less water to grow more food and fiber than there is currently. This reflects, I mean, this is partly based on a model that was used to make these projections, but it also reflects some of the political or power relations that we witness globally. As someone pointed out yesterday, I think irrigation and agriculture usually comes maybe not last. The environment usually comes last, but is the least priority when it comes to allocating water. Cities and human needs come first. Energy and industry very often come second, and it's not clear that irrigation would have ranks very high in the priorities. That projection was very useful to make the case that we need more work on to understand how water is being allocated, because there will be more intense competition to access water from different water users. So we've been looking for solutions, and being an economic organization, the initial reaction was to say that, this is a typical economics issue, how to allocate a scarce resource. And the way we have investigated that was to look into preferred instruments. So economic theory says markets can be a very useful tool to allocate a scarce resource, reflecting different values that different users give to water. Pricing instruments can play a role. Administration, regulated, command and control, if you like, policy responses can also play a role. They may be less preferable for a number of reasons. So we had our economic, if you like, theory background to design potential policy responses, and we used that to do a survey in a very typical OECD way. We surveyed how member countries do allocate water, and so how are they using some of these typical instruments. And so we produced new knowledge in the sense that there is, actually there was no inventory of how of water allocation regimes across OECD countries. So that was a very interesting piece of research. But at the end of the process, once we've done our survey, we realized that the critical point actually is not so much to design the optimal water allocation regime. The first point is that water is already being allocated. Implicitly or explicitly, there are a number of allocation tools being used. So the question is how to transition from the prevailing regime to another one. So it's a very different perspective. Instead of thinking about the optimal regime and how it can be implemented, the key question is how can you manage to change from the existing allocation regime, which may be again more or less implicit, to something which will be more appropriate to or fit to future challenges. So actually the key issue, if we want our work to be relevant, is not so much to focus on the optimal solution, it's to focus on how to manage the reform process. And this is a completely different story. And we approach that in a very different way. We now embark in what we call national policy dialogues. So we work with a small set of countries. Typically, we have a project now ongoing in Brazil. The Brazilian government approaches us and say, well, we understand we have an issue with our water allocation regime, which is dysfunctional. Can you help? And instead of trying to provide them with the typical OECD answer about the benefit of market mechanism, we actually enter in a dialogue, and the word, I really mean it, it's a two-way communication process. And we've been working with the Brazilian government for almost 3 years now, trying to understand what is feasible. Well, first, what is the state of the art of water allocation in Brazil? What is feasible, and how can they transition from the existing system to, the existing regime to something which should be fitter to future challenges? So it's a very different type of cooperating with countries, and a very different type of knowledge that we are using. Based on this experience with the reform of water allocation regime and more work we are doing at the moment on how to finance investment in water security and sustainable growth, I think I would like to reflect on some of the kind of knowledge that would be useful for my work. And the key message here, I think, is that there are very good reasons why optimal solutions don't work. And I would be very concerned about statements, and I heard some of them yesterday, but frankly, I hear them daily in OECD meetings that we know what the solution is. The problem is implementation. I'll get back to that in a moment. So why do optimal solutions don't work? Averages don't exist. There is a tendency when you model things to focus on averages. What actually is really important from a policy perspective are the black swans. Averages, on average, UK is a wet country. In practice, you have floods in parts of the country, you have droughts in others. Average, I'm not quite sure what an average water user is. But what is critical is that some people in Brazil at a particular moment in the year don't have access to the water they need. That's an issue. I'm not quite sure. So you have to be very cautious about using averages. Trade-offs. I think the point was mentioned this morning. Everything we deal with actually generates trade-offs. We have a program on what we call water security, and we define water security as the aggregation of 4 related risks. Risk of too much water, risk of too little water, risk of too polluted water, and risks that affect the resilience of water-related ecosystems. It's all about trade-offs. If you focus on water scarcity only, and yesterday we heard a lot about scarcity, our point is to say you cannot address water scarcity if you don't address at the same time issues of quantity, issues of too much water and flood protection, and issues related to ecosystems. But there are tensions between these different risks or policy objectives, so you'd have to address trade-offs. A point that was made this morning, which is critical, path dependency. Fine to dream about, to fantasize about the optimal solution, but again, as I said this morning, you have to transition from the prevailing state of play to what is considered a better option. And this is very difficult. And there are very good reasons why path dependency occurs and has to be taken into account. And in the end, all this relies on a genuinely political dimension. When it comes to water security or water scarcity, typically, fine, we understand that water may be scarce. And we understand that there may be opportunities maybe to allocate water differently, on some occasions to augment supply, but that comes at a cost. Water security comes at a cost. And the critical question is, what cost is the community really willing to pay to achieve a certain level of security? 100% security doesn't make sense. So the question is, what is the acceptable level of risks that water users are willing to take? What is the acceptable level of risk for farmers? And it certainly depends on a number of different things, the kind of crop they grow, their farming practices and techniques, their capacity to adopt innovation or to invest in water-saving technology. But in the end, the appropriate level of risk is not a technical discussion. it is inherently a political discussion that governments need to face and need to address by engaging with stakeholders, with civil society, with a range of different water users, but also with taxpayers. And how much is the community willing to pay to make sure that some farmers or some households will have access to the water they need? There is no way you can really, you can inform that through new knowledge, research, and hard facts and data. But in the end, there is a genuinely political dimension. And hopefully this is the case. So based on, another thing that we haven't addressed too much over the last 2 days is finance and budgetary decision making, which can actually drive a number of decisions and which play a critical part in path dependency. You will know that it's very difficult for government to redress or redirect budgetary allocation. There is actually a very small amount of money that can be redirected. So when we think about optimal solution, we also have to factor in the political, the financial and budgetary dimensions. What I would like to contend, and that's where I hope I'm not shooting in my own foot, is a lot of what we see in the research community, but also in my own work at the OECD, that there is an implicit theory of change, and I would like to challenge that theory, because if we're serious about, if we agree that the key point is how to transition from a state of play to a preferred course of action, then you need to be able to manage change. The implicit theory is that we know what the solution is. Governments are rational decision makers, so if we can provide them with well-designed, robust information, they will be able to choose the optimal course of action. The problem will be with implementation. In all OECD reports, you will see some statement that the decision which was made was correct. The problem is implementation, lacks implementation. And the way to fix it is to build capacities. I contend that, assuming that the lower ranks in the administration are not able to understand the brilliant vision that inspired policy decision at the top, or that farmers, households don't understand their own interests and they don't have the capacity to implement the policy that was decided. Obviously, I'm being a little bit schematic, but I think it's not too far from what I read, including in OECD reports. I contend that this vision, this implicit theory of change, is technocratic because it's assumed that the optimal solution can be designed independently from a genuinely political process. It is somehow unscientific because from a Popperian perspective, it cannot be falsified. It's tautological. And in the end, you can always say, we made the right decision, but implementation was lagging, and implementation was lagging because you didn't have the right capacities in place at the beginning. So it cannot be, to me, it's really a self-referential narrative. And in a way, it's neo-colonialist. That's a very bad word for an OECD staff. But I was pointed to that by discussing with colleagues, not colleagues actually, a research group in South Africa, and I suppose that Lydia understands what I mean by that. Typically, what you said about IWRM is very much a concept that was designed, but you can say that for most of these brand new ideas about water management. They are designed, in a word, and somehow they disseminate globally, and you will have, in the end, you always have to claim that typically in South Africa, if you want to implement IWM, you will have to build the capacities to make sure that that concept can be implemented and can deliver in that context. I contend it is, I have some sympathy with this idea that it is neo-colonialist approach because it's imposing on a developing country a concept that was born elsewhere and that may not in itself be so much appropriate in that particular context. I would like to call for an alternative theory of change, which would really build on my understanding of critical social theory. And I cannot have a fully developed theory of change at that stage. I'm working on it, but that's more kind of personal research I do with my students in parallel of my work at the OECD. And I'd really be interested to have an interaction with you on here. The first point is to acknowledge the genuinely political dimension of water policy reforms. So, TINA, I mean, there is no alternative. Yes, there are alternatives. We don't know what the solution is. And having the most sophisticated, well-thought solution that cannot be implemented doesn't help. So, I challenge all of my colleagues who come, we know what the solution is, the problem is implementation. Well, what's the point of having the perfect solution if you cannot implement it? I contend that the right solution emerges from practice, emerges from the interplay of stakeholders on the ground. Then it's easy to call for political will. How come, if we have the right decision, how come governments don't take action? Are you sure our governments they don't have the capacity, the willingness to take action? I think the first question to be raised is whose decision? Whom are we talking to? At what scale? Central governments? Cities? I think there is an increasing acknowledgement that cities have a major role to play in water resource management and water security, and I think it's very welcome, but it's only, I don't think we are at the end of the road. There is much more to be done, acknowledging the role of local governance, but also households and farmers. Nobody knows, for instance, how much money farmers invest in water-related technology. When we think about, we've done a lot of work at the OECD on water financing. So I can somehow estimate how much national governments, cities, the World Bank, and others put into large-scale infrastructure. Nobody knows about how much you, as a water user household, how much money you put into water efficiency, for instance, when you buy water-efficient shower heads or washing machines. We don't know how much farmers put of their own money into water efficiency technologies or water-resistant crops. And I think if we had a hint about that kind of knowledge, that could radically change the perspective on financing water-related investment. So at what scale? And again, whose decision? Water users? Probably they are an important part of the game, but what about property developers? The way we build our cities can contribute to water security if we build them right from scratch, but they can also, I'll wrap up, they can also create new liabilities. If we continue building on floodplains, if we continue using technologies which are not fit for heavier rains, driven by climate change, we are missing a big part of the conversation, and we are actually building additional future needs for additional investment. Private equity people, when they put so much of money now in renewable energy, it would make sense to try to see how they factor in the water dimension or the water consequences of their decisions as private investors. So I'm not saying that we should put more private money into the private sector, into the water sector. I'm just saying that these people are making decisions which have a direct impact on water availability and water demand. So how to make sure that we liaise with them and we engage with them. So political will, the issue of who is making the the decisions that really, in the end, affect water availability and water demand is critical. Implementation, and as I said, in the implicit theory of change, implementation is a threat because we have the smart solution. Now there is a risk that implementation will somehow betray or be unfaithful to the initial decision. I contend that implementation is actually an opportunity. Implementation is an opportunity for people to take ownership of the decision, reinvent, redress, and challenge some of the initial assumptions. But that requires a fairly different approach to water management and policy reform. Finally, and that's my last comment, Raymond, it's about building capacities. We've seen that typically if we want to implement IWRM in South Africa, you would have to build capacities so that local I mean, administration, bureaucrats, administration, water users in South Africa understand IWM and can embark in that kind of narrative. I wished we put much more emphasis on understanding what are the know-how already available in South Africa and how can we derive smart water management, smart water policies from the local capacities which are already there. It's easy to disqualify this know-how saying, well, it's not fit to implement IWM. Fine, but it may be very fit to implement other approaches which may be just as efficient in the South African context. If you look at the work of people like Eleanor Ostrom, sorry, it's an economist, but and a Nobel Prize economist, but one of the, sorry?
She's also a political scientist.
Indeed, but she's a Nobel Prize winner for economics, and she's one of the few Nobel Prize winners that OECD staff usually don't read. Guess why? She had very interesting stories about typically people in Yemen who have been allocating a scarce water resource for centuries, if not millennia. Obviously, if you impose on Yemen a new framework like IWM, their capacities may not be fit to manage or to implement IWM in the proper way. But it has proven to be quite robust and capable in managing water differently. So I wish, instead of always asking to build more capacities and somehow imposing a global, unquestioned model about water resource management, I wish we put a little bit more, we spend a little bit more time trying to assess and really value the local know-how which is already there and see how it can inform or inspire smart water policy. I'll leave it here. Obviously, the last two slides are, as you can understand, miles away from typical OECD rhetoric. But I think that that was a great opportunity to address an academic audience, to try to take a step back. And I hope you see some value in these questions. And I really look forward to the discussion, including with people who are practitioners and who usually I tend to listen to. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Xavier. Well, brilliant to see you sharing your experience, but in particular also, well, coming back to us and challenging us with your own elements of a critical social theory. Probably most of us didn't expect it, that you come up with a theory here. I myself feel now a bit challenged to come back to you with a couple of questions, so might feel others. So my first implementation gap in running this panel is that I would like to invite one or two questions directly related to your presentation before I go back to the panel, which indeed has originally been my plan, to have done the full panel first. So if somebody else feels illuminated or provoked to raise a question, then feel free to do so. If that's been too much of a challenge for the time being, yeah, Tony and Lydia. Tony and Lydia.
Tony Allen, King's College London. Thank you very much for raising the tone, as it were. You're correct to fix on politics. Politics are very devious, very important. I've attended a couple of meetings at OECD where I am frustrated by your unwillingness to include farmers in the audience, because they manage, as I've said already here, 92% of the water, all the rainfall, which is 70% of the water that we use for food production, and also the blue water. So if you're wanting to get the politics right, you need to understand what the farmers are doing and why they can't do what we would like them to do, or the population in a democratic society hasn't got the message that we need the farmers to mind and steward the environment, but we want them to produce half-cost food or low-priced food, underpriced food in circumstances of poverty, and politicians look after that and make sure that prices are, food prices are underpriced. And that happens in the first part of the food supply chain, where it's a failed market. I use that. I'm not an economist, so I don't quite feel able to use that term, but it's a failed market because it doesn't capture all the things that are happening there, and governments have to stuff an awful lot of money in welfare for farmers at least. And then we've got the part of the market which is nearly perfect, certainly effective, where we've got the trading, the processing, and the retailing, and that works well. The accountants make our accounting rules, which there aren't in the other part. And then in the third part of the supply chain, we've got the consumers being helped to have underpriced food. Now that's in the background. If you look at a list of top priorities, there was a list in the UK paper recently on what were the top anxieties in politics terms and in voters terms, and things at the top are health and all the other 10 things. The environment isn't there anyway, water isn't there at all, nor actually is the food side, because it's so backgrounded as an issue, and it's been backgrounded for decades, and the politicians keep it that way because it is even more, it's so important it can't even be on the agenda to be discussed. And therefore, water is, as part of that politics is interesting. I'd love to find OECD leading on, farmers manage so much of the water as well as the emissions, as well as the biodiversity.
Thank you.
It's a tricky point. I tend to agree. I mean, you may have understood that I don't consider myself as a typical OECD staff, and in my work, I really try to engage with farmers. Typically, in the work we do in Brazil, and Jan can contribute. I mean, can confirm because he's part of the process. I mean, my vision about water allocation regime changed when I had to meet 50 Brazilian farmers and explain them that at some point they may have access to less water to grow more food. So that's where you understand what the really political economy of reform means. So I really try to engage with farmers, and as I said, I'm really trying at the moment to try to see how we could compile some robust data about how much money farmers put into water management. That would be, I think, potentially a game changer on the vision of the landscape about water finance. One difficulty I face is that, I mean, we try to be global and to engage with, I mean, to address global issues with its own limitations. It's very difficult to find a global group of farmers. I try to engage with, I mean, there is a global, I mean, you find international networks of irrigators, but they usually represent large-scale, technology-savvy farmers. I was trying to engage with a more mundane group of farmers who may not be irrigators and who may be more diverse. And it was very difficult to actually, and I failed, to identify whom I should talk to. I mean, there is a World Farmers Organization, something like that. I tried to engage with them. Apparently, it's a very small organization, very small secretariat. They don't have the time, they don't see the value, maybe, of engaging with organizations like the OECD. But that's an issue. It's very easy to liaise with to engage with the corporate sector, energy, finance.
With the science community, but farmers actually do it for us.
I know, but if I want to involve them in our work, I need a counterpart. I need to find a World Farmers Organization that can somehow represent more than large-scale irrigators, and they are very difficult to identify.
Farmers don't go to science, they go to power. So if there's some chance that they can have some influence.
I guess we got the point. Thank you. You're trying, but indeed the point is there. Lydia.
Thank you very much. That was refreshing for me, surprising from the OECD. I didn't quite expect that. So great, thank you. So I want to just push you a bit because, I mean, you spoke about your the critical theory of change at the end, and I agree with that. So I have two questions. One is the OECD and other global bodies have massive convening power. So you do push these models of water allocation reform, of pricing, of market solutions, of efficiency, etc. And they don't end up actually reallocating water often from the haves to the have-nots. And there's all sorts of issues there at play. Some of it I mentioned earlier, and you mentioned that. So how do you change the equation? And finally, how do you lift this local know-how? How can you bridge the divide? So if you do want to actually focus on local expertise or the way people do it in Yemen or South Africa or wherever, how do you do that? And finally, you said, who are the farmers' organizations? There are, you know, go to the CFS and hang out there with some of the local organizations, the Viva Campesinas and others. They may not explicitly be looking at water, but I think there's a need to push those linkages more between water and food and a lot of these more radical farmer organizations. So they're out there, actually.
Well, I'd be happy to know more. I mean, we can discuss bilaterally on this, because I was really trying to find the appropriate community. And thank you also for pointing at the schizophrenic part of my work. I fully appreciate that the OECD contributes to promoting some of these models that I'm now challenging. You know, after my PhD, I had a decision to make whether I would stay in the academic community. And really, my choice was driven by where can I have the most impact. And in the end, I decided to join first the corporate sector and now an organization like the OECD, because my hope is that from within, I can maybe change the way the OECD approaches that kind of thing. And I think that in my work, typically, I never refer to IWRM. And I try to challenge my colleagues who refer to that and challenge them saying, well, you take it for granted that this is the model, that this is the way to go. Are you aware of the political dimension of it? Are you aware of the potential consequences that it will have? It's an uphill battle. It's one which is difficult to win. But you know, my career choice joining the OECD was to say that, well, maybe if I join from within, I can make some changes. And that's why also the policy dialogue that I mentioned are not typical OECD work. Actually, we started that in the water sector, and it's actually now inspiring other colleagues working in other areas, because typically when we do that kind of work, that's where we engage with local communities, that's where we understand why economics 101 or optimal solutions don't work for very good reasons. And it's not a lack of capacity, it's not a lack of implementation, it's actually that these solutions, these economics 101 solutions, usually don't understand what the real issues are, what are the capabilities on which we can build locally. So, and the work we do in the policy dialogues actually inform the kind of policy, comparative policy analysis that we do, and it helps me understand why typical OECD rhetoric about water management has limited value.
All right. Thank you.
To be continued.
Very valuable. Wonderful. Please sit down. So thank you very much.